The Grand Lyric Theater had been dark for 20 years. Once a crown jewel of the city's art scene, it had gained an eerie reputation after a series of inexplicable disappearances. Actors, directors, and even stagehands had vanished without a trace, all last seen within its opulent but aging dressing rooms. After decades of abandonment, a new investor had taken a chance on the cursed venue, determined to bring it back to life. The city buzzed with excitement. A fresh production, The Phantom Masquerade, was set to open in just a month. But whispers circulated among the cast and crew. Some claimed the disappearances were no accident. The dressing rooms, in particular, held an unsettling air. Their gilded mirrors stood tall against peeling wallpaper, their glass surfaces worn but strangely unclouded, as though never touched by time. The air carried a faint perfume of dust, mothballs, and something else, something damp and metallic. No matter how often the crew scrubbed the walls, the scent lingered. The lead actress, Evelyn Moreau, had spent her first day rehearsing, but as soon as she stepped into the dressing room assigned to her, a chill ran down her spine. The air inside was different, heavier, charged with something unseen. Evelyn wasn't one to scare easily. She had performed in eerie theaters before, had spent nights in abandoned playhouses for roles that required method acting, yet nothing compared to the unease she felt in that room. Her vanity mirror stood directly across from the door, reflecting an empty hallway behind her. She swore for just a second that she saw something move in the glass, a flicker like a candle in the wind. But when she turned around, there was nothing. She convinced herself it was exhaustion. The excitement of a grand reopening, combined with long rehearsals, could easily play tricks on the mind. Yet, as she sat down and removed her earrings, a whisper brushed against her ear. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of a script's pages. Evelyn froze. Her eyes flicked to the mirror. The hallway in the reflection remained empty, but the room felt smaller now, like the walls had shifted an inch closer when she wasn't looking. Determined to shake off the paranoia, she reached for her compact powder, but her hand hesitated. The surface of her vanity was coated in a fine layer of dust, except for a single, unmistakable word drawn onto it: stay. A rational mind would dismiss it as a prank. The crew had been playful, teasing each other about the building's history, but there was something unsettling about the way the letters were formed. The strokes were uneven, erratic, as if written with an unsteady hand, or one that did not belong to the living. The next day, the crew buzzed with discussions about strange occurrences. A stagehand claimed to have heard muffled sobs behind the walls. Another actor mentioned that his props had been rearranged, though no one had been in the room. The whispers grew louder, each tale adding to the mounting dread. But no one wanted to say it aloud. The possibility that the disappearances had never truly stopped. Evelyn, however, refused to be spooked. The theater had history, yes, but history was often just a collection of exaggerated stories. She arrived early the next morning, determined to own her space, to erase the fear that threatened to grip her. With a deep breath, she stepped into her dressing room. The air was cold, sharper than before. She glanced at her mirror, and for a moment, she could have sworn she saw a figure standing in the hallway's reflection, still watching. Her breath hitched, but she refused to turn around this time. Instead, she lifted her chin and reached forward, touching the surface of the mirror. The glass was ice cold, far colder than it should have been. And then, just as she was about to pull away, her reflection did not move with her. The realization sent a bolt of horror through her veins. Her mind struggled to grasp what she was seeing. Her mirrored self sat perfectly still, eyes wide, mouth slightly parted as though gasping for air. Evelyn staggered back, knocking over a chair. In that instant, the reflection caught up, mirroring her once more, as if nothing had happened. But she knew something was inside the dressing room with her, and it had been waiting. Evelyn did not speak of what she had seen. Not to the director, not to the crew, not even to herself in the quiet moments when doubt crept in. To acknowledge it would be to give it power, and she was not ready for that. Instead, she convinced herself it had been stress, exhaustion, a trick of the light. Yet, as she sat before the vanity mirror that evening, brushing out her hair, she could not shake the feeling that something inside the glass had been watching her long before she ever noticed. The dressing room was silent, except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. The other actors had left for the night, their laughter and footsteps long faded into the city's restless hum. Evelyn had stayed behind, determined to rehearse alone, to prove to herself that fear was only in the mind. But as the minutes passed, the stillness of the room became unbearable. The silence wasn't empty, it was listening. She turned on the small radio, sitting near the mirror, filling the space with a soft crackle of classical music. The melody should have been comforting, a shield against the growing unease, but instead, it only made the quiet between the notes more oppressive. Then, as she reached for her script, the music stuttered. A sharp burst of static crackled through the speakers, and in that brief distortion, she heard it, a whisper, low and breathy, just beneath the noise. Evelyn froze. Her fingers hovered over the radio dial, her breath caught in her throat. The music resumed, smooth as before, as if nothing had happened. But she had heard it. The whisper had not been part of the broadcast. It had been close. Too close. She swallowed hard and turned off the radio, deciding silence was better than the alternative. Gathering her belongings, she stood, ready to leave. But as she moved past the vanity, she noticed something that made her blood turn cold. The fine layer of dust on the surface had been disturbed again, this time forming not a word, but a symbol, a spiral. It was crude, hurried, almost frantic. The shape meant nothing to her, yet it felt deliberate, a message from someone or something that desperately needed to be heard. She ran a trembling hand over the dust, erasing the symbol as if that could undo its meaning. And then the mirror breathed. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but she saw it. The glass expanded outward, as if exhaling, and then contracted back into place. A ripple passed across its surface, distorting her reflection just enough to make her stomach churn. For a moment, her own face blurred into something unrecognizable, her eyes too dark, her mouth twisted in an expression she did not make. Evelyn stumbled back, knocking over a chair in her panic. The sound shattered the room's heavy silence, and as she scrambled to her feet, the mirror returned to normal. Her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed, terrified, but undeniably her own. She did not wait to question it. She grabbed her bag and fled, the dressing room door slamming shut behind her. As she rushed down the dimly lit hallway, her mind raced with explanations, but none felt sufficient. Had she imagined it? Could stress truly twist reality in such a way? And then, just as she reached the exit, she heard it again, soft, nearly lost in the distance. A whisper, curling through the empty halls like smoke. Evelyn, stay. Evelyn did not sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the mirror ripple, her reflection staring back at her with features just slightly wrong. The whispered voice curled in her mind, distant yet intimate, as though it had spoken from inside her own head. By morning, exhaustion draped over her like a heavy curtain, but she forced herself to go back to the theater. She had to prove, to herself, to the cast, to whatever had taken an interest in her, that she was not afraid. The others greeted her with the usual morning chatter, oblivious to the weight she carried from the night before. The dressing room keys jingled in her hand as she hesitated outside the door. It was absurd to be afraid of an empty room, of a mirror that had never harmed her, of dust and whispers that could be explained away. Yet, as she turned the knob and stepped inside, her skin prickled with the certainty that she was not alone. The mirror stood exactly where she had left it. The dust was undisturbed, no cryptic symbols drawn overnight. Everything appeared normal. But that was the problem. It looked too normal, as if someone had carefully reset the stage after last night's performance of terror. The air was still heavy, charged, like the static before a storm. Evelyn approached the vanity cautiously, her reflection moving with her in perfect sync. She exhaled, half laughing at herself. She had let her imagination run wild. Reaching for a brush, She paused as her fingers touched something strange. A photograph. It was old, its edges curled and yellowed with time. The image showed a woman sitting at the very same vanity, dressed in a costume eerily similar to the one Evelyn wore for the Phantom Masquerade. Her face was familiar, too familiar, like a faded copy of Evelyn's own features, though slightly off in a way she couldn't pinpoint. A name was scrawled in ink on the back. Margaret Holloway, 1936. Her breath caught. Margaret Holloway. The name was vaguely familiar, like an actor's name mentioned in passing in theater folklore. She fumbled for her phone, searching the name online. The results sent a chill through her bones. Margaret Holloway had been the lead actress in a production at the Grand Lyric Theater nearly a century ago. She had vanished on opening night, right here in this dressing room. No body, no witnesses. Just a final performance and an empty mirror left behind. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the photograph. It was impossible. How had this been left for her to find? Who had placed it there? The mirror shuddered. Not a trick of the eye this time. The surface wavered, as if water had been disturbed beneath the glass. Evelyn stepped back, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. And then, just for a second, her reflection did not step back with her. She gasped, stumbling away, knocking the photograph from the vanity. Her reflection remained still for just a moment longer before. Finally, smoothly, it caught up. But something was different now. The woman in the mirror was not Evelyn anymore. The longer she stared, the more she saw subtle, shifting features, a resemblance bending and twisting like an unfinished painting. Margaret Holloway was staring back at her. Evelyn ran. She had not stopped to look back. As she fled down the hallway, the whisper followed her, curling around the edges of her mind. "You're next." Evelyn did not return to the dressing room for the rest of the day. Instead, she buried herself in rehearsals, letting the movements and lines anchor her to reality. The rhythm of performance was predictable, safe, far safer than the mirror, the whispers, or the photograph of a woman who should not have been staring back at her. She told no one about what had happened. What could she say? That a dead actress was watching her through the glass? That her own reflection had hesitated before following her movements? She could already imagine the responses. Exhaustion, stress, maybe even a subconscious projection of stage fright. But she was not afraid of the stage. She was afraid of what lay behind it. By evening, the theater had emptied once again, and Evelyn forced herself to stay behind. If she ran now, if she let fear dictate her actions, she would never set foot in this building again. She had to reclaim control. She had to prove to herself that there was nothing there. Still, her steps were hesitant as she approached the dressing room. The door loomed taller than before, as though the theater itself had stretched, waiting to consume her. She inhaled sharply and pushed it open. The room was unchanged, except for the mirror. A thin crack now ran through the glass, splitting the reflection in two. It had not been there before. Evelyn stepped closer, her breath fogging up the surface. Something felt wrong. It was not just the crack. It was the depth of the reflection, as if the glass no longer showed an image but an opening. And then, from the depths of the fractured mirror, a sound emerged. A knock. 3 sharp taps from the other side of the glass. Evelyn's stomach twisted. It was impossible. She reached out instinctively, her fingertips hovering just over the surface. As soon as she did, something else pressed back from within. A handprint, faint, smeared, as though someone was trapped on the other side, reaching for her. A scream built in her throat, but before it could escape, the handprint faded. The crack in the mirror sealed itself, smooth and unbroken. The dressing room was quiet once again. Evelyn stumbled back, her heart pounding. She could no longer deny what was happening. The dressing room was not haunted in the traditional sense. It was something worse. It was waiting for her, and whatever was inside the mirror wanted out. Evelyn did not sleep that night. The knocking from the mirror echoed in her mind, reverberating with each beat of her racing heart. She had spent hours after the incident trying to rationalize it, but no logic could explain what she had seen. The crack that sealed itself, the handprint that pressed against the glass from the inside. It all defied reality. She told herself that she would avoid the dressing room entirely from now on, that she would finish the show and leave the theater behind for good. But fate had other plans. The next day, the cast was in chaos. Something was wrong, something that had nothing to do with Evelyn's own haunting experience. As soon as she stepped into the rehearsal hall, she knew. People were speaking in hushed, panicked tones, faces drawn with unease. She spotted Gabriel, one of the stagehands, looking pale as he argued with the director. "What's going on?" Evelyn asked, her voice tight. Gabriel turned to her, his eyes wide. "It's Daniel." Daniel was one of the lead actors, playing the Phantom in the Phantom Masquerade. He was talented, charismatic, and always the first one at rehearsals. Evelyn frowned. "What about him?" "He's gone," Gabriel said. "No one has seen him since last night." A chill crawled up Evelyn's spine. "What do you mean, gone?" Gabriel ran a hand through his hair, his fingers shaking slightly. He stayed late, practicing lines in his dressing room. But he never made it home. His phone is still in the theater. His costume is still hanging up. It's like he just vanished. Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. "Which dressing room?" Gabriel hesitated before answering. "Number 6. The world tilted slightly beneath Evelyn's feet. "Dressing room 6. Her dressing room. The one with the mirror. She could barely breathe as she processed the information. Had Daniel seen something? Had he touched the mirror? Had it taken him? No, that was impossible. She was letting fear twist her thoughts. There had to be a logical explanation. But then, Evelyn remembered the whisper that had followed her from the dressing room the night before. "You're next." The thought sent ice through her veins. Daniel had disappeared after she had run from the mirror. Had it wanted her? And when she fled, had it taken him instead? She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. This wasn't just a haunted theater. It wasn't just a trick of the mind. Something in that dressing room was taking people. And if she didn't find out how to stop it, she knew with terrifying certainty. She would be next. Evelyn spent the rest of the day locked in a cycle of unease. The police had been called about Daniel's disappearance, but there was nothing they could do beyond starting an investigation. No sign of a struggle, no evidence of a break-in, no clues, just the eerie fact that his belongings were still in the theater, untouched, as if he had stepped out for a moment and never returned. She wanted to tell someone about the mirror, about the handprint, about the whisper, but what could she say? That Daniel had been taken by a dressing room? That she thought something was hiding behind glass? She imagined the looks of concern, the careful glances exchanged between the director and the other cast members. They would think she had lost her mind. So she said nothing. Instead, she made a decision, a reckless, terrifying decision that sent her stomach twisting into knots. She had to go back. She had to face it. By the time rehearsals ended and the cast began filtering out, Evelyn lingered behind, pretending to go over her lines. She waited until the last footsteps faded down the hallway before she turned toward dressing room 6. The door was slightly ajar, as if it had been expecting her. She stepped inside cautiously, her breath shallow. The mirror stood there, perfectly intact. No cracks, no handprints, no signs of the horror she had witnessed the night before. It looked normal, too normal. Evelyn swallowed hard and took a step closer. The silence in the room felt oppressive, thick with something she could not name. Her own reflection stared back at her, wary and uncertain. She raised a hand slowly. Her reflection did the same. And then, her reflection smiled. Evelyn gasped, stumbling back against the vanity. She had not smiled. She had not moved. But the version of her in the mirror had curled its lips into a slow, knowing grin. Her heart pounded as the reflection returned to normal, mirroring her wide-eyed terror. Had she imagined it? Was it another trick of the mind? Another sign that she was losing herself to fear? No, she knew what she had seen. And then, just as she turned to flee, the whisper returned. A voice, barely audible, slipping from the depths of the mirror. "He's still here." Evelyn froze. Her blood turned to ice. Daniel. The mirror had taken him. And if it had taken him, that meant he wasn't gone. He was trapped, somewhere beyond the glass. Evelyn stood paralyzed in front of the mirror, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The words still echoed in her mind. He's still here. The voice had been soft, almost pleading, but it carried a weight that pressed against her chest. Daniel had not simply disappeared. He had been taken. Swallowing hard, she forced herself to move, inching closer to the glass. Her reflection looked shaken, her face pale, her lips slightly parted in fear. She reached out, hesitating just before her fingertips could make contact. The surface of the mirror remained smooth and unbroken. Nothing stirred. No handprints. No unnatural smiles. For a moment, she considered turning away, leaving the theater and never looking back. But something inside her resisted. If Daniel was truly trapped somewhere beyond the glass, she could not abandon him. She had to understand what was happening. Summoning all the courage she had left, she whispered, "Daniel, can you hear me?" The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Evelyn's pulse pounded in her ears, and just when she was about to give up, the mirror rippled. Like the surface of a pond disturbed by a single drop of water, the glass trembled, distorting her reflection for the briefest second before settling once more. Evelyn's breath hitched. She wasn't imagining it. Someone was in there. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but she stayed rooted in place. "Daniel," she tried again, her voice firmer this time. "If you're there, say something." The whisper returned, but this time it was not a single voice. It was many, a chorus of murmurs overlapping, voices bleeding into one another. Some were desperate, others were hollow and resigned. "Help us." Evelyn's stomach twisted. This was no longer about Daniel alone. Others had been taken before him. She had always thought the stories of disappearing actors were just urban legends, but now she understood the truth. This dressing room had been consuming people for years. Her hands clenched into fists. She could not ignore this. She could not pretend it wasn't real. But how could she fight something she didn't understand? A thought occurred to her. If the mirror had sealed itself before, maybe it could open again. Maybe there was a way to reach inside. She took a steadying breath and placed her palm flat against the surface. It was cool beneath her skin, unyielding at first, until suddenly the temperature shifted. The cold became warmth, the glass softening, as though turning to liquid beneath her touch. And then something grabbed her wrist. A hand, cold and desperate, latched onto her from within the mirror. Evelyn screamed, trying to pull away, but the grip tightened, yanking her forward. The world tilted violently, and before she could react, the mirror swallowed her whole. Evelyn fell forward, expecting the hard floor of the dressing room to meet her. Instead, she plunged into a suffocating darkness, a weightless void that swallowed her whole. The air was thick, pressing against her skin like a second layer, and for a terrifying moment, she wasn't sure if she was falling or floating. Then, with a sudden force, she landed. The impact wasn't painful, but it sent a shock through her body. She was lying on something solid, cold, smooth, and slightly reflective. As she pushed herself up, a strange sensation crept over her, like stepping into a dream she couldn't wake from. The world around her was wrong. She was still in a dressing room, or rather a twisted copy of it. The same vanity table stood against the wall, the same rows of dim, flickering bulbs lining the mirror's edges. But everything had an unsettling, warped quality. The light seemed weaker, drained of warmth, casting eerie shadows that stretched unnaturally across the floor. The walls pulsed faintly, as if breathing. And then there was the mirror. It stood before her, but now it was a window, revealing the dressing room she had just left. She could see it exactly as it had been, only now she was on the wrong side. Her heart pounded as she stepped closer. That's when she saw herself, or rather, something that looked like her. On the other side of the glass, her reflection remained frozen in place. But it wasn't copying her movements. It simply watched. A perfect replica, identical in every way except for one detail: its eyes. The irises were black voids, deep and endless, staring back at Evelyn with a sickening stillness. She swallowed hard, fighting back the rising panic. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." She turned away, forcing herself to breathe. She couldn't afford to lose control. She needed to understand where she was, and more importantly, she needed to find Daniel. A faint sound echoed in the distance, a whisper, or perhaps a breath. Evelyn stiffened. She was not alone. She moved cautiously, stepping past the warped vanity and deeper into the dressing room. The space seemed to stretch, growing longer than it should be. The doors leading to the hallway were gone. There was only more dressing room, repeating itself over and over like an endless loop. Then she saw them. Figures. Shadows standing just beyond the dim glow of the vanity lights. Their outlines flickered, shifting unnaturally, as if struggling to remain solid. Some stood motionless, while others twitched violently. And in the center of them all, Daniel. He was there, kneeling on the floor, his head bowed, his hands pressed against his ears as if trying to block out something unbearable. Evelyn ran toward him. Daniel, his head snapped up. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, filled with terror. "No," he gasped. "You shouldn't be here. You have to leave." Before she could respond, the whispers returned, growing louder, swirling around her in a deafening spiral. And this time they were angry. The whispers slithered through the air like a swarm of unseen insects, filling Evelyn's ears with fragmented voices that bled into one another. Some were pleading, others were furious, but they all carried the same undercurrent of desperation. The shadows in the distance flickered violently, their forms twisting as though something was straining to escape from within them. Daniel was still on the floor, his breaths ragged, his hands clenched into fists. Evelyn dropped to her knees beside him, gripping his shoulders. "Daniel, look at me," she pleaded. "I'm getting you out of here." But his head jerked from side to side in frantic denial. "You don't understand," he whispered. "They won't let us leave." A cold dread sank into Evelyn's bones. She could feel the presence of the figures around them now, like a weight pressing against her chest. When she looked up, she realized that the shadows had moved closer, circling them, their distorted bodies flickering in and out of visibility. And then one of them spoke, or rather, many of them did, all at once in perfect unison. She does not belong. The voices struck her like a physical force, rattling inside her skull. Evelyn gasped, instinctively pulling Daniel closer as the figures loomed. Their features remained indistinct, but their presence was suffocating, an overwhelming tide of sorrow, rage, and something deeper, something hungry. She came through the mirror. Another voice whispered from somewhere among them. "She is still whole. She can still leave." The final statement sent a shiver through Evelyn. She didn't know how she had ended up in this place, but now she understood. This was what happened to the actors who had vanished. They hadn't simply disappeared. They had been claimed, trapped. Daniel's grip on her arm tightened. "Evelyn," he whispered, "don't listen to them." But it was too late. The shadows surged forward. Evelyn barely had time to react before icy hands clamped around her wrists, her shoulders, her legs, cold, insubstantial fingers digging into her skin. A wave of unbearable cold washed over her as the figures pulled, dragging her downward, as if the floor itself was swallowing her whole. She struggled, kicking against the force, but the more she fought, the heavier it became. It felt like drowning in ink, thick and endless, wrapping around her limbs, seeping into her lungs. A single thought cut through the panic. If I give in, I won't come back. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, Evelyn twisted her body, wrenching one arm free. Her hand shot out, blindly searching, until her fingers found Daniel's. The moment their hands connected, the darkness shuddered. The whispering stopped, the shadows recoiled, and the dressing room cracked, a jagged, splintering sound that echoed through the void. Evelyn gasped as light, bright, searing light, exploded from the mirror behind them. It was the first warm thing she had felt since falling into this nightmare. The figures screamed, their forms distorting as they retreated from the glow. Daniel pulled her toward the light. "Run!" And together, they lunged for the mirror, toward the only way out, before the darkness could claim them forever. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest as she and Daniel sprinted toward the mirror. The oppressive darkness, once suffocating, now seemed to reach for them with renewed intensity, its grasp pulling them back as they fought to escape. Every step felt like a battle against invisible forces, but Evelyn's resolve burned brighter than the fear coiling around her. She could feel the heat of the light drawing closer, a promise of escape, of freedom from the nightmare they had entered. Behind them, the screeching of the shadows grew louder, more frantic, as though they were aware of the impending escape. The mirror's surface shimmered with an almost alive quality, like the thin line between the world Evelyn knew and the world she had just left was growing thinner by the second. Daniel's hand tightened around hers, his breath coming in sharp, desperate gasps. "We're almost there," he said, his voice hoarse with panic. "We can make it." Evelyn wanted to believe him, but doubt lingered like a dark cloud over her thoughts. Would it really work? Was the mirror the way out? Or was it simply another trap, another illusion designed to lure them into a false sense of security? The shadows were close now, too close. Evelyn could hear their low, guttural murmurs, their voices rising in a frantic chorus that blurred into one continuous, dissonant sound. They were desperate, clawing at the air around them, pulling at the very fabric of reality. It was as if the mirror itself was the only thing standing between them and being swallowed whole by the void. But Evelyn didn't hesitate. She had seen too much to turn back now. They had to make it. She was determined to make it. With one final burst of strength, she flung herself forward, dragging Daniel with her. As her hand touched the mirror's surface, she expected cold glass, but instead, her fingers sunk into it, as though the mirror had become liquid, alive. Her pulse quickened as she felt herself being pulled in, her body sucked into the light as if it were a current, a force beyond her control. "Evelyn!" Daniel shouted, his grip slipping. For one terrifying moment, she feared she was about to be separated from him, lost to whatever lay on the other side. But then his hand found hers again, and together they were pulled through. The transition was instantaneous. One moment, they were surrounded by the suffocating darkness of the dressing room, and the next, they were standing on solid ground, gasping for air in the familiar, dimly lit dressing room of the theater. The air here was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and aged wood, but it was real. They had returned. Evelyn collapsed onto the floor, her heart still racing, her breath ragged. She blinked against the harshness of the fluorescent lights above, trying to ground herself in the familiar, but the sense of wrongness lingered. They had escaped, but something still felt out of place. The mirror, now back to its usual reflective surface, seemed to pulse with a faint, unsettling energy, as if it remembered what had happened. Daniel sat beside her, his face pale, his hands trembling. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn didn't have an answer. She couldn't bring herself to lie. Was it over? They were back. Yes, but that didn't mean the danger was gone. She stood up slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. The mirror in the corner of the room stared back at her, a silent witness to their escape. But what else had it seen? What other secrets did it hold? "Maybe we should leave," Daniel suggested, his voice raw. "Get out of here. This place it's not right." Evelyn nodded, but her feet didn't move. Her mind raced, replaying everything that had happened. Every moment of terror, every encounter with the shadows, every whisper. There was something she was missing, something important. She felt it deep in her gut, like an echo that refused to fade. And then it hit her. It wasn't the mirror that had been the problem. It was them. The figures, the voices, the ones who had been trapped for so long. They had wanted something from her, something she couldn't understand, something they had been waiting for. "Evelyn," Daniel's voice broke through her thoughts. "What's wrong?" She turned to face him, her expression grave. "It's not over," she said softly. "We've only just begun." Her heart sank as the weight of her words settled over her. There was something still out there, something lurking in the dark, something that was no longer confined to the mirror. And if she didn't figure it out, it wouldn't just take her. It would take them all. As the days passed since their escape, Evelyn found herself unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The theater, once a familiar and comforting space, now seemed alien, cold, and unsettling. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of fabric, every flicker of the lights felt as though it was an invitation to something else, something that lingered just out of sight. The whispers in the dark had not ceased. If anything, they had grown louder, closer. They haunted her thoughts, filling the empty spaces with fragmented phrases, words that seemed to slip away before she could fully grasp their meaning. It was clear to Evelyn now that whatever she had encountered in that mirror world was not bound by its confines. She had felt in the air when she and Daniel had returned to the dressing room, a palpable shift, a fracture in reality itself. The figures, the shadows that had once tormented them, were not just remnants of some forgotten past. They were alive, and they were waiting. But waiting for what? Evelyn had spent countless hours scouring the theater for answers, combing through old scripts, diaries, and anything that might offer a hint of the theater's history. She learned that the building had been around for decades, once a renowned venue known for its extravagant performances. But over the years, the theater had faded into obscurity, and the acts became fewer and fewer. It was easy to understand why. Those who had worked there had become disillusioned, exhausted, and, in some cases, vanished. The disappearances were not documented in any official capacity. It was as though they had simply never happened. But there were whispers, the kind of whispers that are passed down through generations, the kind that the older members of the crew would mutter in hushed voices when the lights dimmed. The whispers spoke of a curse, a pact made long ago, a ritual gone wrong, and an entity that had been trapped, bound within the confines of the theater's walls. Evelyn's blood ran cold as she came across a single line in one of the old theater manager's journals. "The actors are the price for the gift that keeps us performing." She stared at the words, her hands trembling. The price for the gift. What did that mean? What gift could possibly justify the loss of so many lives? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Daniel entered, his face drawn and pale, as if he hadn't slept in days. He was holding a bundle of old papers, and his eyes were wide with something Evelyn couldn't quite place. "Evelyn, you need to see this," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. He laid the papers on the table, revealing a series of photographs, grainy, black and white images of past performances. At first glance, they appear to be nothing more than a collection of actors mid-performance, frozen in dramatic poses. But as Evelyn leaned in closer, she noticed something unsettling in the background. Figures. Figures that weren't part of the play. In each photo, there were faint, shadowy forms lurking at the edges, barely visible, almost blending into the darkness of the theater's shadows. But as she studied the images, Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. Some of the figures seemed to be moving, slithering in the periphery of the shot, their limbs elongated, their bodies twisted in unnatural ways. "They've always been here," Daniel whispered. Evelyn's stomach churned. "Who are they?" Daniel shook his head. "I don't know, but I think they've always been watching. I think they've always been waiting for someone to notice." Evelyn closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath. She could feel the weight of the history around her pressing down, suffocating her. The theater had always been a place for the performers, a place where people came to lose themselves in the magic of the stage. But now, it was a tomb, a prison for the souls of those who had vanished, and it was clear that the shadows were not just remnants of the past. They were still here, still lingering, still watching. A sudden noise, a scraping sound from behind the door, jolted them both. Evelyn's head snapped toward the sound, her heartbeat quickening. She wasn't alone. The air in the room seemed to thicken, heavy with the presence of something unseen. She stood up, her hands shaking. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice tight. But as she moved toward the door, the lights flickered. For a split second, the reflection in the mirror caught her attention. For just a brief moment, she saw it, an actor. His face was pale, gaunt, his eyes hollow, and his mouth twisted into a knowing grin. He was staring directly at her from the reflection. But when she looked back at the mirror, it was empty. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The figure was gone, but she knew, without a doubt, that she had seen him. the same way she had seen the shadows before. The ones who had always been there, waiting for the right moment. Waiting for her. "Daniel," she said, her voice trembling. "We've made a mistake. We haven't escaped. We never left." Daniel turned to her, his face pale. "What do you mean?" She could hear it now, the soft tapping of feet, the gentle rustling of fabric from the hallway outside. And then, the door opened. The actor stepped inside. His grin had widened. The actor's entrance felt like the breaking of a dam. Evelyn's heart raced as the door creaked open, and the figure of the man, gaunt and hollow-eyed, stepped into the room. His presence was unnerving, his movements deliberate but fluid, as though he were gliding through the air rather than walking. The actor's eyes, dark pools of emptiness, locked onto Evelyn's with an intensity that made the air grow thick with tension. There was no sound, just the faint rustling of his clothes as he stepped forward. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The actor didn't need to. His gaze alone conveyed everything. There was no malice in the way he looked at them, no anger, no hatred. It was as though he were simply observing them, studying them as one might examine an interesting artifact. His smile, twisted and knowing, revealed nothing of his intentions, only an unsettling calm that left Evelyn with an unshakable sense of dread. Evelyn's mouth went dry. The actor's appearance had not been entirely unexpected. For days, she had been piecing together fragments of history, snippets of forgotten performances, and whispers of a curse that had plagued this very theater. She had known that the shadows, the figures that had haunted the dressing room, were not mere figments of her imagination. But to see one of them standing in front of her, flesh and blood, felt like the final confirmation of her worst fears. These were no ordinary ghosts. They were actors, bound to the stage by a pact, one that transcended death itself. She had to speak, to do something. Evelyn could feel her body trembling, but her voice found its way out. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse. The actor tilted his head slightly, as though pondering the question. Then, in a voice that was low and barely audible, he answered, "I am part of the show." His words were so simple, yet they carried a weight that pressed down on Evelyn's chest. Before she could respond, Daniel stepped forward, his face a mixture of confusion and fear. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice strained. The actor's smile deepened, and for a moment, Evelyn saw something that sent a chill down her spine. Something not quite human in his expression, a flicker of something darker. "The show never ends," he replied, the words rolling off his tongue like a dark lullaby. Evelyn felt a cold wave of realization wash over her. This wasn't just a story of ghostly apparitions or spirits trapped in the theater. No, this was something more sinister, something more ancient. The actor's words echoed in her mind. The show never ends. It was a confession, but also a warning. The performers, the actors who had disappeared over the years, were not merely victims of some supernatural force. They were part of it, part of a cycle that had been repeating for as long as the theater had existed. Evelyn's thoughts scrambled for meaning. The pact, the whispers in the dark, the sacrifices made by the actors. They weren't just for a fleeting moment of fame or fortune. They were bound by something much darker, something that required them to perform over and over again, as if the theater were some kind of twisted stage where they were both audience and performer in an eternal cycle. "We can't leave," Evelyn said, more to herself than to anyone else. "We're part of it now." Daniel's face drained of color. "What do you mean? What have we become?" The actor's eyes flickered with something akin to sympathy, but there was no comfort in his gaze. "You already are," he said softly. "You're already part of the performance. There's no escaping it. There's only the show." Evelyn's mind raced, but before she could ask more, the actor stepped back, slowly retreating toward the door. His movements were fluid, almost graceful, and he never broke eye contact. It was as if he were an extension of the theater itself, a manifestation of its will. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Evelyn and Daniel in stunned silence. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The air in the room felt heavier now, charged with an invisible force that both repelled and beckoned them. The truth of what had just transpired settled like a stone in the pit of Evelyn's stomach. They were no longer spectators. They were part of the performance, bound by a pact they didn't fully understand. She turned to Daniel, her voice trembling. "We need to figure out how to stop this, how to break the pact." Daniel nodded, but his expression was one of defeat. "How? If we're part of it now, how do we break free?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Evelyn's mind was clouded with the weight of what she had learned, but one thing was clear. The theater was not just a building. It was a living, breathing entity, and they were caught in its web. The pact had been made long before they arrived, and the actors before them had played their roles without question, trapped in the same cycle. The theater's curse wasn't a curse at all. It was a contract forged in blood, sweat, and sacrifice. And now, she and Daniel were bound to it. Evelyn's eyes flickered toward the mirror, where the faint reflection of the dressing room seemed to shimmer, as if beckoning her. She felt the pull of the stage, the desire to perform, to be seen. But there was no escape, not from the theater, not from the performance. In the end, she realized the actors were not just trapped by the theater. They were the theater itself. The chilling silence of the dressing room lingered, thick and suffocating, long after the actor had disappeared into the shadows. Evelyn stood frozen, the weight of his words pressing against her chest like a vice. "You're part of the show," the actor had said, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. And yet, those words had shattered everything she thought she knew about the theater, about life, and about herself. She had expected to find answers, not to be drawn deeper into a mystery that threatened to consume her. Daniel paced nervously, his footsteps soft on the wooden floor. The faint creak of the floorboards seemed louder now, as though the very building itself was alive, listening. Evelyn could feel it too, the growing sense of unease that gnawed at her from within, a sense that they were being watched. But by whom? Or what? The theater, with its aging walls and decaying grandeur, seemed like an entity unto itself, pulsing with an energy that she could not quite grasp. "Do you think he was telling the truth?" Daniel asked, his voice breaking the silence. His words hung in the air like smoke, uncertain, fragile. He was clearly struggling to process the enormity of what they had just experienced. Evelyn took a deep breath, her thoughts racing. "I don't know," she replied quietly. "But it makes sense, doesn't it? Everything we've seen, the disappearing actors, the strange feeling in this room, the whispers we've heard. It all points to something we're not seeing. Something darker." The room seemed to contract as Evelyn spoke, the air growing heavier. She glanced around, suddenly aware of the cracks in the walls, the peeling paint, and the old furniture that had witnessed decades of performances. The dressing room was a relic, preserved not for its beauty, but for its function. It was a place where actors had come to prepare, to transform. But now it felt like a tomb. "Do you think we're trapped here?" Daniel asked, his voice laced with fear. They were part of some performance, like he said. Evelyn's mind reeled. The idea that they were trapped in the theater, bound by some invisible force, seemed impossible to accept. And yet, everything she had witnessed suggested it was true. The theater, once a place of creativity and expression, had become a prison, a place where the lines between the living and the dead blurred. The pact that had been made, whatever it was as old as the building itself, and now they were caught in its web. "I don't know," she replied, her voice distant. "But I think we need to find out. The only way out is to understand what's happening here. We need to learn what the pact is and how it works. And most importantly, how to break it." Daniel nodded. Though his face was pale, his eyes haunted by something unseen. "But how do we even begin? How do we fight something like this?" Evelyn's gaze wandered to the mirror, the one that had seemed to hold some sort of power, reflecting not just her own image, but the very essence of the room around her. She felt a strange pull, a magnetic force that drew her toward it. The mirror had been silent since the actor's departure, but Evelyn sensed that it held the key. Something about it was connected to the theater, to the performance, and perhaps to the pact itself. She reached for the mirror, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched its cold surface. For a moment, Nothing happened. The glass remained dark, like a dormant beast, unresponsive to her touch. But then, slowly, her reflection began to shift. It was subtle at first, just a flicker, a distortion of her image, but it grew more pronounced. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as she watched, transfixed. Her reflection smiled, but it wasn't her smile. It was twisted, wrong, as though it were mocking her. It was the smile of someone, or something, that had no business being in that room. "Evelyn," Daniel whispered, his voice shaking. "What's happening?" Evelyn backed away from the mirror, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "I don't know, but I think we just crossed into the rehearsal." The air around them grew colder, and Evelyn could feel it, the subtle shift, the change in the atmosphere. It was as though the theater was coming to life, and they were no longer mere visitors. They were part of something much bigger. The mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was a window into the performance, into the show that had ensnared them. "Do you hear that?" Daniel asked, his eyes wide with fear. Evelyn paused, straining her ears. The faintest sound, a rustle, a whisper, seemed to float through the air, emanating from all corners of the room. It was as if the very walls of the dressing room were alive, whispering secrets to each other in a language they could not understand. But the whispers weren't meant for them. They were meant for the actors, the ones who had disappeared. Evelyn felt the ground beneath her feet tremble. The building seemed to shake, as though it were alive, breathing. The mirror, still reflecting her distorted image, began to glow faintly. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind with a sense of urgency, a sense of impending doom. The show was beginning. The rehearsal had started. She turned to Daniel, her eyes wide with terror. "We need to leave. Now." But before she could reach the door, the room around them shifted. The walls seemed to stretch. The floorboards creaked and groaned as though they were moving. Evelyn felt herself being pulled toward the center of the room, as if the theater itself was beckoning her to take part in the performance. The mirror flashed once more, and suddenly, the dressing room was no longer empty. Figures appeared in the reflection. Actors, their faces contorted in silent screams, their bodies frozen in the midst of some eternal, agonizing performance. The pact, it seemed, was not just a contract between the living and the dead. It was a contract between the actors and the theater itself, a contract that had been signed with blood, with sacrifice. And now, Evelyn and Daniel were part of it. The rehearsal had begun, and they had no choice but to play their parts. The rehearsal had begun, but it didn't feel like one. Evelyn felt the weight of the theater's ancient walls pressing down on her, and the whispers had become insistent, maddening even. The dressing room was no longer a room of mirrors and lights. It had transformed into something else entirely. An arena, a stage, a place where reality and illusion collided. The reflection in the mirror, with its distorted versions of the actors, was a constant reminder that they were no longer observers. They had become participants. Daniel was pacing nervously by the door, his face pale, his hands trembling. He had never believed in the supernatural, never even considered that the world could hold something as terrifying as this. But the air had changed, thick with an energy that felt wrong, unnatural. The mirrors had not just shown the actors, but something deeper, something beneath the skin of the theater. As though the building itself had a consciousness, a will, an insatiable hunger. "I don't understand," Daniel muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "What are we supposed to do? How do we stop this?" Evelyn was silent for a moment, her eyes fixed on the shifting reflection in the mirror. She could see the actors now, not just their faces contorted in silent screams, but their bodies frozen in grotesque poses. They were still, but their eyes, they moved. Their eyes followed her, beckoning her into the reflection, as if they wanted her to join them. Her breath hitched in her throat as she realized the truth. The actors were not just part of show, they were prisoners, trapped in an eternal loop, forced to perform over and over again, their souls bound to the stage in a pact with the theater itself. They weren't actors at all. They were masks, living masks, their true selves locked away behind the facade they were forced to wear. The show wasn't just an act, it was a trap, a cycle with no end. And they were next. "Evelyn, look at this," Daniel said, his voice sharp with fear. She turned to find him holding something in his hand, a mask. It was a simple thing, made of cold, lifeless porcelain, its features blank and empty. But when she looked closer, her stomach churned. The mask wasn't just an inanimate object. It was alive. Its eyes seemed to glint in the dim light, and the smile on its face twisted in an unnatural way. It's one of them." Evelyn breathed, her heart pounding. The mask, she realized, was part of the ritual. It was the key to understanding the pact. The actors wore masks, not just to transform into their characters, but to hide their true selves, to shield their humanity from the darkness that lurked beneath. But now it seemed the mask had chosen them. It was a symbol, a link between the living and the dead, between the performers and the theater itself. As she reached out to take the mask from Daniel, something strange happened. The moment her fingers brushed its surface, she felt a shock, a jolt of icy energy coursing through her body. Her vision blurred, and for a split second, the world around her seemed to collapse into darkness. She saw herself, or rather, her reflection, wearing the mask. But it wasn't just a reflection. It was an alternate version of herself, twisted, distorted, her face hidden behind the cold porcelain. The Evelyn in the mirror smiled, but it was a cruel, mocking smile. When the vision passed, she stumbled back, gasping for air. "It's trying to take us," she whispered, her voice trembling. The mask wasn't just a symbol. It was a vessel, a way for the theater to consume them, to make them part of its endless, horrifying performance. Daniel was shaking now, the mask still clutched in his hand. "What do we do, Evelyn? How do we stop it?" Evelyn didn't have an answer. She felt trapped, the weight of the theater's power pressing down on her chest like a vice. The walls seemed to close in, the mirror reflecting not just her image but something darker, something that watched, something that waited. The theater was alive, and they were its newest cast members. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, sharp and deliberate. Evelyn and Daniel froze, their hearts racing. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was the director, the man who had first invited them to the theater, to the performance. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and his clothes were disheveled, as if he hadn't slept in days. He looked at them with a mixture of pity and resignation. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked quietly, his voice low and resigned. "You've seen the truth. The mask. The actors. The pact. It's all real. It's been real for so long. And now you're part of it, whether you like it or not." Evelyn's mind raced. "How do we stop it?" she demanded. "How do we break the cycle?" The director's eyes darkened. "You can't break it," he said, his voice heavy with finality. "None of us can. The pact is unbreakable. It's the price of the theater, the price of art. The actors who perform, they wear the masks, they become the show. And now you will too. You will wear your own mask, and you will take your place on the stage." Daniel backed away, his face pale with terror. "We can't. We won't." The director's smile was cold, empty. "You don't have a choice." In that moment, Evelyn realized the horrifying truth. They had crossed a line. The theater had claimed them, and now they were part of its macabre performance. There was no escape, no way out. The mask, the pact, the endless cycle, they were all part of the show, and now they were actors, trapped in a role they could never escape. The days that followed were a blur. Evelyn could no longer tell where the theater ended and where her mind began. Each morning, she awoke in the same dressing room, the mirrors still reflecting that warped version of herself, now more familiar, yet equally alien. Her reflection didn't merely mimic her actions, it anticipated them. She was no longer in control of her own body, and the slow, suffocating reality of this revelation was beginning to gnaw at her. It was as if the theater had become a part of her, intertwining itself with her thoughts, her very essence. The lines between the actress and the character had blurred. Daniel's transformation was more subtle, but it was there. His eyes, once filled with disbelief and defiance, had grown distant, clouded by a quiet resignation. They no longer spoke of escape or resistance. It was as if they had both accepted their fate without truly saying it aloud. The theater had its grip on them, and every inch of their being was under its control. In the rehearsal hall, they were no longer actors in a play. They were puppets on strings, forced to follow the will of the theater. The director watched from the shadows, his eyes cold and calculating. He had become more of a presence than a person, a symbol of the inescapable power the theater held over them. No longer was there laughter, camaraderie, or even the comfort of shared purpose. Every rehearsal felt more like a trial, an endurance test to see how long they could last before they were consumed by the play. Evelyn could feel the weight of the mask growing heavier each day. It no longer sat just on her face. It seemed to seep into her very soul. At night, she would lie in bed and hear whispers, soft murmurs of forgotten lines, stolen from her own thoughts. She knew the words by heart now, knew them like the back of her hand. It was as if the mask was teaching her the script, preparing her to step onto the stage, to perform in front of an audience she could never escape. The theater wasn't just a place for performance. It was a prison, and the play was the sentence. One evening, during another one of the grueling rehearsals, something shifted. A voice, clear, strong, but unfamiliar, cut through the silence. It wasn't the directors. It wasn't the other actors. It came from somewhere deep within the theater itself, as if the walls were speaking. Evelyn froze in place, the words sinking deep into her bones. You are no longer free. You have become part of the performance, part of the show. The script is now yours to live, and there is no exit. The voice was chilling, but it wasn't a warning. It was a statement of fact. It didn't belong to any of them, nor did it belong to the director. It was a voice from the theater itself, an omnipotent entity that seemed to rule the space. Evelyn looked around frantically, but the other actors didn't seem to hear it. They were locked in their own movements, their faces blank and unseeing. The voice had chosen her, had chosen all of them, and now they were all part of something much darker than a mere performance. Daniel, noticing her distress, stepped closer. "What's wrong?" he whispered, his voice full of fear. "What did you hear?" But Evelyn couldn't answer. She had no words for it. The voice had spoken the truth, and she felt the suffocating weight of it now. She had been pulled into this world, this performance, and there was no escape. The theater had devoured them all, and its hunger would never be satisfied. Later that night, alone in the dressing room, Evelyn stared into the mirror once more. The mask was no longer just an object. It was a part of her, a reflection of the darkness that had consumed her. It wasn't her face staring back at her anymore. It was the face of the character she was doomed to play, the character that had already been written into the script of the theater's twisted narrative. She reached out and touched the mask, feeling its cold surface against her skin. The moment her fingers brushed it, the mirror warped and the reflection shifted. She saw herself, not as an actress, but as a mere shadow, her body moving against its own will, her face contorted into a smile that was both grotesque and hollow. She wasn't Evelyn anymore. She had become the character, and the character had become her. And then the moment passed. The reflection returned to its familiar, distorted version of her, but the truth lingered in the back of her mind. The theater had its claws in her, and no amount of willpower or defiance could ever undo what had already been done. She was part of the play. She was bound to it now. At that moment, the door to the dressing room creaked open, and the director stepped inside. His gaze was unreadable, his expression hard. There was something about him now, something different. The last time she had seen him, he had been nothing more than a figurehead of the theater, a man whose presence seemed to command but never to truly control. But now, he radiated authority. He wasn't just the director. He was a part of the theater itself, as much a prisoner as any of them. "Evelyn," he said softly, his voice low and calm. "It's time." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Time for what? Was this the moment when she would take her place on the stage? Was this the moment she would lose herself completely, becoming one of the faceless performers trapped within the theater's endless cycle? The director didn't wait for an answer. He simply gestured toward the door. "The audience is waiting," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made Evelyn's heart race. And the show must go on. Without another word, Evelyn stood and walked toward the door, the mask heavy in her hand. As she stepped into the darkness beyond, she could hear the faint echoes of the audience, waiting for her, waiting for the performance to begin. But as she crossed the threshold, she understood. There would be no curtain call. There would be no applause. This wasn't a show. This was their reality now, and it would never end. The theater had always been a place of escape, a place where actors and audience alike could lose themselves in a story. But as Evelyn stepped onto the stage that night, it felt different. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the shadows in the theater seemed to move with a mind of their own. She could feel their gaze, cold and unblinking, fixed upon her as if they were waiting for something, waiting for her to make a mistake, to break, to show a flicker of doubt. The audience was there, yet not quite. It was as though they were more of a presence than real people. It was the kind of silence that presses on your chest, that makes your pulse quicken with a sense of impending doom. The stage was set with a single, dimly lit spotlight, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. She stepped into its warmth, the light feeling like an old friend, though it was anything but comforting now. There was no script in her hand, no lines to memorize. The play had already been written for her. She was simply to perform, to live out the role she had been cast in, and to follow its inevitable course to the end. She looked around, but the set was unfamiliar, as if it had morphed since the last rehearsal. The walls seemed to shift in her peripheral vision, the curtains rippling like a wave in slow motion, though there was no breeze. The props that had once felt like mere stage elements now seemed strangely alive, watching her, waiting for her to interact with them in a specific way. Her eyes caught the chair at the center of the stage, positioned in the spotlight. The director's command echoed in her mind. The show must go on. Evelyn moved toward the chair, her feet heavy with dread. With each step, she could hear the faint creak of the wooden floorboards beneath her, their groans resembling the whispers that had followed her since her first night in the dressing room. They were there, buried in the walls, the floors, the ceilings, carrying secrets from a time long past. The theater wasn't just a building. It was a living entity, pulsating with the rhythm of forgotten souls who had once walked its halls, who had performed in the same spot she now stood. As she sat in the chair, the spotlight blinding her, she felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on her. It was then that she noticed them, the silhouettes in the back row. Figures cloaked in darkness, their features indistinguishable, but their presence undeniable. They were watching her, observing every movement, every breath. They were no longer the audience. They were the watchers, the judges, and the jury. There was no applause, no cheer, just silence, a silence that gnawed at her, twisted her nerves until she could barely breathe. The chair beneath her felt colder now, its wooden frame beginning to splinter under the pressure. It wasn't the weight of her body that caused the stress. It was the weight of the expectations that hung in the air. The theater had a way of making its demands known, not through words, but through an oppressive atmosphere, a lingering force that twisted reality itself. Evelyn could feel it now more than ever. The walls were closing in on her, the light above flickering as if something or someone was toying with the very fabric of the world around her. As she sat there, motionless, trying to gather her thoughts, a movement caught her eye. To her left, the shadows seemed to stir, taking form in a way that defied logic. A figure emerged from the darkness, a silhouette of someone she recognized. It was Daniel, his face pale and strained, his eyes wide with fear. But as he stepped forward, something was wrong. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as though he were being controlled by strings. His expression was empty, a hollow mask of what he once was. "Daniel," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. "What's happening?" He didn't answer. Instead, his body twisted unnaturally, his limbs extending at odd angles. The shadows around him thickened, curling around him like a suffocating cocoon. Evelyn tried to stand, to run to him, but her body refused to move. She was rooted to the chair, her body betraying her once more. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence, a low, guttural sound that sent a chill down her spine. It came from Daniel, but it wasn't his voice. It was distorted, broken, as if it had been dragged from the depths of something dark and ancient. "You cannot escape," the voice rasped. "This is your fate. This is the role you are meant to play." The figure of Daniel jerked violently, his form collapsing to the floor in a heap, the shadows dissipating around him. Evelyn's heart raced, and she fought with every ounce of strength to move, to do something. Anything, but the theater's grip was too strong. It held her in place, a puppet on invisible strings. The audience shifted again, their movements subtle but unsettling. They weren't watching her. They were watching the play unfold, waiting for her to take the next step, to perform the next scene. But this wasn't a performance. This was real. This was her life being rewritten over and over by an unseen hand. Evelyn's mind raced as the reality of her situation sank in. She had become part of the theater, an unwilling performer in a play with no ending. The audience wasn't just a passive observer. They were complicit in her torment. Every movement, every glance, every breath was part of the script they had all been forced to follow. And the worst part? She wasn't alone. Daniel's distorted form, now crumpled at the edge of the stage, was a reminder that none of them were. The theater was consuming them one by one. The audience, the director, the actors, they were all part of the same dark design. There was no escape. As the final curtain fell, Evelyn understood the horrifying truth. The theater was not a place of art or entertainment. It was a place of endless repetition, a prison for the soul, where performers were trapped in a cycle of horror and despair. The play would never end, and neither would she. The world outside the theater felt distant now, as if it were slipping further away with every passing second. Evelyn had long since lost track of time. The once comforting thought of returning to the normalcy of her life seemed like a distant memory, a forgotten dream buried deep in the recesses of her mind. The walls of the theater had closed in around her, its oppressive weight crushing her with every breath she took. The audience, those faceless, shadowed figures, were still there, but they were no longer silent observers. They were part of the play now, as integral as the actors themselves. And Evelyn was no longer just a participant. She was a pawn, trapped in an endless loop, rehearsing a performance that never reached its final act. Her eyes wandered over the stage, the once grand set now dilapidated and twisted. The props that had once seemed so ordinary, chairs, curtains, even the walls themselves, had become something else entirely. They had taken on a life of their own, shifting and changing when she wasn't looking. They seemed to mock her, to remind her that nothing here was as it appeared. Even the air felt wrong, thick with the scent of dust and decay, as though the theater itself had been abandoned for years, and yet it remained alive with a malevolent presence. The spotlight was still there, an unwavering beam of light that illuminated her in the center of the stage, but had lost its warmth. It no longer felt like a guiding force, a spotlight that marked the beginning of a new scene. Now it felt like a trap, drawing her further into the nightmare that was her reality. She couldn't escape its gaze, no matter how hard she tried. No matter how she moved, the light followed her, and the shadows were always watching. She remembered the rehearsals, the way they used to be, the days spent learning lines, perfecting her movements, preparing to perform. Back then, the theater had been a place of ambition and hope. She had loved the craft, loved the thrill of stepping into the shoes of another character, of living another life for a few hours. But now, every memory of those rehearsals felt like a lie. The words she had once spoken so effortlessly now seemed foreign, strange, and distant. The lines that had once come so easily now felt like a trap, a labyrinth of forgotten phrases and half-formed thoughts. Her eyes flicked to the wings of the stage. There, behind the curtains, she could see the faintest movement. A figure, hunched and motionless, stood in the shadows, just out of the reach of the spotlight. Evelyn felt a chill creep up her spine. She wasn't sure if it was a person or a figment of her imagination, but it didn't matter. She had long ago stopped questioning what was real and what was not. In the theater, reality was a fluid concept, one that shifted and changed like the shifting of the stage lights. A voice called out to her, a whisper that seemed to come from all around. "You've forgotten the lines, Evelyn." Her heart skipped a beat. It was a voice she recognized, but she couldn't place it. The voice of the director, perhaps? Or maybe it was Daniel's, echoing in her mind from the moment he had twisted and fallen. She wasn't sure. What she was sure of was that the words, those forgotten lines, were real. They had been part of the script, part of the rehearsal. But they had slipped away, lost to time, lost to the darkness that now enveloped the theater. The whisper came again, more insistent this time. "You must remember the words. You must speak them." Evelyn's throat tightened. She opened her mouth to speak, to call out, but no sound came. She felt her lips move, but the words were absent. Her mind screamed for the words, for the lines she had once known by heart. But they refused to come. The silence in the theater pressed in on her, suffocating her, as if the very air itself was conspiring to keep her from speaking. She could feel the weight of the audience's gaze, their unblinking stare, as if they were waiting for her to perform, to get it right. But what was the play? What was the point of the performance? There were no answers. There was no script to follow. She was simply being pushed through the motions, forced to play a role she didn't understand, trapped in a cycle of rehearsals that had no beginning and no end. In that moment, Evelyn realized the horrifying truth. The rehearsal had never ended. It was the same performance, the same lines, over and over again. She had rehearsed them, yes, but they were lost, and the play, it seemed, had been erased from memory, leaving only the need to repeat, to practice, to get it right, though the right was something that had long since vanished. The audience stirred, their presence growing more palpable, more oppressive with each passing moment. She could hear the faintest rustle of fabric, the subtle shift of bodies in their seats. They were waiting for her to remember, waiting for her to speak the lines that had been lost. But the more she tried, the more distant they became, slipping further away into the shadows. And then, as if on cue, the curtains on stage twitched. They pulled back slightly, just enough for Evelyn to see what lay beyond them. She wasn't sure if it was real, if it was just another trick of her mind. But there, in the dim light, stood figures. Hundreds of them, all staring at her with hollow eyes. Their faces were blank, expressionless, and yet somehow filled with expectation. They were not actors, not spectators, but something else, something that had always been a part of the theater, waiting, watching, judging. "Remember," the voice whispered again, and Evelyn knew then that the rehearsal would never end, that the performance would continue forever. The forgotten words, the lost script, would be her prison, and she would perform, trapped in an endless loop, forever bound to the theater's cruel demands. The curtain fell once more. The theater had become more than just a place of performance. It had become a living, breathing entity that was impossible to escape. Evelyn had always known that the boundaries between the world of the stage and the real world were porous, but she never imagined that the line could blur to the point of collapse. The theater, once a symbol of creativity and escape, had transformed into a suffocating, all-encompassing nightmare. What had begun as an innocent act of rehearsal had evolved into an endless cycle of haunting performances, with no audience to speak of, only the oppressive gaze of something far more sinister. It was not just the audience that had changed, but Evelyn herself. She could no longer remember who she was before this all began, before the rehearsal that had started and never ended. She tried, at times, to reach into the depths of her mind, to pull out a shred of her former self. But it was as if the very act of remembering was a betrayal, an act of defiance against the power of the theater that held her captive. She had become an unwilling performer, a puppet on strings, moving in accordance with the theater's strange, unnatural will. The audience, those shadowy, silent figures who filled the seats, had once been faceless, indistinct. But now, they had taken on a more solid form. They sat in the darkness, their eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on her every move. Their presence was undeniable, and yet Evelyn could not remember the moment they had become so solid, so alive. They were not just spectators. They were participants in this cursed cycle, their existence entwined with the performance in a way that defied logic and reason. She had tried to address them, to speak to them, but her voice had faltered each time. No words came to her. The silence between them was heavy, suffocating. It pressed in on her from all sides, until she felt as though she might drown in it. Every time she moved, they shifted ever so slightly in their seats, their eyes tracking her every motion. It was as though they were waiting for something, for her to speak, for her to perform, but she no longer knew what to do. She had lost the script, lost the rhythm, and she could no longer remember why any of this mattered. The stage lights above her flickered, casting long shadows that twisted and contorted in strange shapes. She had stopped trying to make sense of them long ago. The light itself seemed to have a will of its own, acting as though it were a separate force in this warped theater. It moved of its own accord, shifting with her every motion, drawing her deeper into the play, or perhaps trapping her further inside its confines. There was no longer a sense of time or place. There was only the stage, the audience, and the oppressive weight of expectation that hung in the air. The curtain behind her stirred once more, the faintest rustling sound breaking the silence. Evelyn's eyes darted toward it, her pulse quickening. She had grown accustomed to the strange, inexplicable sounds that echoed through the theater. The creak of the floorboards, the whisper of unseen voices, the flutter of fabric in the distance. But this was different. This felt deliberate, intentional. The curtain was parting inch by inch, as if someone or something were pushing against it from the other side. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Was it another performer? Another soul trapped within the confines of the stage, waiting for their chance to break free? Or was it something worse, something darker, something that had been lurking in the wings, biding its time? She wasn't sure, but she knew one thing. She couldn't let it happen. Not again. She couldn't go through another performance, another rehearsal, another round of forgotten words and empty expectations. With a surge of determination, she moved toward the curtain, her body trembling as she reached out to part it herself. As her fingers brushed the fabric, a jolt of electricity shot through her, and for the briefest moment, she felt as though she were falling into a chasm, lost in a void of darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest as the curtain finally gave way, revealing what lay beyond. The other side of the curtain was not what she expected. It was not a backstage area, not a dressing room, nor a hallway that led to freedom. It was another audience, another row of seats stretching out into infinity, filled with faceless, featureless spectators. They stared at her in silence, their eyes unwavering, their expressions unreadable. It was as if the entire theater had expanded, as if the audience had multiplied into an endless sea of watching eyes. Evelyn stumbled back, horrified. This was not just an audience. It was a collection of all the spectators she had ever known, every person who had ever watched her perform, every face she had ever seen in the crowd. But they weren't real. They couldn't be. They were part of the theater, part of the trap that had ensnared her. She wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but the words wouldn't come. Her body refused to move. And then, from the sea of eyes, a figure emerged. It was impossible to say how it moved, how it came into being. One moment, it wasn't there, and the next, it was standing in the center of the audience, staring directly at her. It was a man, tall and thin, with dark eyes that seemed to pierce through her very soul. His face was familiar, yet unfamiliar, a face she recognized but couldn't place, a face she should know but had long since forgotten. The figure reached out a hand toward her, beckoning her forward. Without thinking, Evelyn took a step toward him, her feet moving of their own accord. She couldn't stop herself, couldn't bring herself to resist. The man's eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Evelyn felt something stir inside her. A spark of recognition, a flicker of understanding. She knew him. She had always known him. But how? She was no longer sure of anything. The theater had consumed her, and with it, every trace of the life she once knew. The line between reality and performance had long since disappeared, and she was left, like the others before her, to perform a play with no script, no audience, and no end. The figure's hand remained outstretched. She had no choice but to take it. Evelyn had once believed that the final act of a performance was the most difficult, the one that required the greatest emotional effort, the one that marked the end of a journey. But as she stepped into the unknown, following the figure's outstretched hand into the void of the theater's endless audience, she realized how terribly wrong she had been. The final act wasn't about achieving closure or bringing resolution. No, it was something far more unsettling, far more infinite, a trap that had no ending, only more and more performances, more and more of herself being consumed by the stage. As her fingers brushed the figure's cold hand, she felt a surge of energy coursing through her, a surge that didn't belong to her. It wasn't the warmth of a human connection. It was something alien, something ancient. The figure's hand seemed to merge with hers, as though they were no longer separate entities, but parts of one singular being, locked in a dance that had lasted for eternity. Her vision blurred, and she felt herself being pulled into the depths of the theater, deeper into its heart, until the edges of her reality began to collapse entirely. She could no longer discern where the audience ended and where she began. It was then that the figure spoke, his voice a whisper that seemed to reverberate throughout the very fabric of the theater. You think you've been performing all this time, Evelyn, but you've never truly performed. Not yet. You've only been rehearsing for something far more important than any show you've ever done. Evelyn wanted to speak, to ask what he meant, but her mouth wouldn't obey her. She couldn't form words, couldn't bring her voice to life in this place where everything felt wrong, like a dream that had turned dark. The figure's gaze bore into her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "This is the true performance," he continued, his voice low, almost melodic. "The one where you're both the actor and the audience, where you are both the creator and the created. You've always been part of the show, Evelyn, but now, you're the show itself." The revelation struck her like a blow. The idea that she was not merely a part of the performance, but the very essence of it, the core around which everything revolved, made her stomach turn. She had always believed that the stage was a space for expression, for the exploration of stories, for the sharing of emotions. But what if it had been manipulating her all along? What if the theater, with its vast history of performances, its ghosts of actors long gone, had been feeding off of her, drawing her deeper into a cycle from which there was no escape? As the figure's words echoed in her mind, the audience began to stir. For the first time, Evelyn realized that their eyes were not just watching her. They were pulling something from her, something vital, something that could not be returned. The theater itself had become a parasite, leeching off of the performers, its hunger insatiable, always needing more. Evelyn had been its latest victim, its most recent offering to the ever-hungry void. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. Every performance she had given, every time she had stepped onto the stage, had been a sacrifice. A piece of herself had been lost in each act, until now, when there was nothing left but a hollow shell. The air around her grew heavy, thick with a pressure that made it difficult to breathe. The audience seemed to multiply, their numbers expanding in all directions, filling the infinite rows of seats. They were no longer just spectators. They were part of the theater, part of the system that kept it alive, that kept it feeding. And Evelyn was the source of that sustenance, the center of it all. She had never been in control. She had never been the one calling the shots. She struggled against the pull, but it was futile. The theater's grip on her tightened with each passing second. The lights above flickered violently, casting long, grotesque shadows across the stage. The figure, still holding her hand, smiled, an empty, knowing smile that made Evelyn's blood run cold. "You don't understand, do you?" he said, his voice now a low growl. "You've always been part of this place, Evelyn. The moment you stepped onto the stage, you became ours. You belong to the theater, and we, we belong to you. The words reverberated in her skull, each syllable pounding like a drumbeat. She had never understood the true nature of the theater, had never realized that it was not just a space for art, but a living, breathing entity. An entity that fed off the emotions of its actors, its audiences. An entity that could not exist without them. She had been its offering, its sacrifice, just as so many before her had been. Suddenly, the theater began to shift. The walls of the stage seemed to close in around her, the seats of the audience folding into one another, the very structure of the building warping and twisting like a funhouse mirror. The lights grew dimmer, the shadows deeper, until the theater had become a living maze, a nightmare without end. The audience, now a mass of faceless, contorted figures, continued to watch her with vacant eyes, their expressions frozen in eternal expectation. Evelyn realized, with a sickening clarity, that she was no longer in control. She had become the centerpiece of an unending performance, a performance that would never end, never reach its final curtain. The audience would never leave. The theater would never empty. She would never be free. The play had no conclusion, only an infinite cycle of performances, each more haunting than the last. With a final, desperate cry, Evelyn tried to escape, to break free from the theater's grasp, but her body betrayed her. She could not move, could not run, could not scream loud enough to break the silence. The theater had won. The final act had arrived, and it was not an end, but a beginning, an eternal beginning that would repeat itself over and over again. As the curtain fell once more, Evelyn realized the truth. She was not just a part of the play. She was the play, and there was no escape from it. The theater was no longer a mere structure of wood, stone, and light. It had become something else, something insidious and all-encompassing. Evelyn had long since lost track of time. The concept of hours, days, even moments had dissolved in the haze of her existence. She no longer felt the rush of blood in her veins or the flutter of her heartbeat. It was as though her very essence had been absorbed into the fabric of the theater itself. She had become part of its endless cycle, its eternal performance. It was maddening, this realization. The theater, the dark, cavernous hall that once felt like a stage for her to express herself, to be celebrated, had now turned into a prison, a labyrinth with no exit. The audience, once a sea of watchful eyes, had transformed into a grotesque mass, ever present, their faces twisted in strange, unblinking expectation. They were not just spectators. They were part of the performance, or perhaps they were part of her. She could no longer tell. Their hollow stares had no warmth, no human recognition. They were feeding on her in a way she could never have imagined. Each time she tried to break free, to escape the stage, she was pulled back into the performance, as if the very theater itself reached out with unseen hands, gripping her, forcing her to play her part. The final act was not an event. It was a state of being, an unending cycle of despair and revelation. She had thought she could change the ending, could shift the narrative, but the truth was that the play had no ending. There was no final curtain call, no applause, no closure. The story looped, repeated, reset again and again, each time more suffocating than the last. Evelyn now understood that she was trapped in an endless loop of performances. It wasn't just her body that had been claimed by the theater. It was her soul. She was no longer the lead actress in a show. She was the show itself, the focus of a macabre audience that would never leave, never tire of watching, and never forget. And that was the true horror. The eternal, unyielding nature of the theater, the fact that it didn't need her to live, it was already living through her. Every movement, every gesture she made was part of its hunger, part of the endless performance that it demanded. There were moments, fleeting and strange, where she almost believed she could see the people she had once known in the audience. Their faces flickered among the sea of unseen figures, her old friends, family members, fellow actors. But as quickly as she saw them, they were gone. The theater was not only a physical space. It was a place of distortion, of warped memories and illusions. Nothing in this place was real anymore. It was all part of the show, a show where nothing could be trusted, not even the memories that had once given her life meaning. Evelyn found herself wondering if she had ever truly left the stage. Had she ever left this place? Or had the theater always been her home, its walls a silent witness to her struggle, her despair? It was hard to tell. There was no clear before or after. Time had become irrelevant, and reality had become an elastic concept that stretched and twisted until it no longer resembled anything she had known. She had been playing her role for so long that she wasn't sure where the play ended and where she began. She was lost in the act of being, consumed by the very place that had once offered her a chance for self-expression. Her thoughts grew hazy, as though they were drifting through a fog. She couldn't remember what it had felt like to be free, to have the world beyond the theater at her fingertips. It seemed like a distant dream, one that she couldn't quite reach, no matter how much she wanted to. The theater had taken that dream from her. It had twisted her mind, broken her will, until she was no longer the person she once was. She had become a puppet, and the theater was the master. And yet, in the strangest of ways, there was a part of her that couldn't quite give up. A part that still longed for the warmth of the sun, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the taste of the world beyond these walls. It was a futile hope, a whisper of resistance in the face of overwhelming darkness. But that faint spark, that tiny ember of defiance, refused to be extinguished. It reminded her of something she had once known, something that no longer had a place in this world. It reminded her that there was more to life than performance. But the theater wasn't finished with her. No, it would never be finished. It would continue to draw her in, to pull her back into its cold embrace. The final act wasn't an escape. It was just another layer in an endless performance, a step in an unbroken chain of illusions. She was never meant to escape. The show would never end. As she stood there, in the center of the stage, surrounded by the endless gaze of the audience, Evelyn could feel the weight of her existence pressing down on her. She had once been a part of the audience, once been a person who could watch a show unfold. But now she was the show. The realization was suffocating, yet strangely liberating. She had no choice but to accept it. She had no choice but to keep performing. There was no final curtain. There was no end. Only the eternal, maddening silence of the theater. And so, the performance continued. Every step she took, every line she spoke, every gesture she made was part of the cycle, part of the play that would never stop. The audience would never tire. The theater would never fall silent. Evelyn had become the eternal player, and the show, like the theater itself, would never end.